we've seen AlphaZero lose from opening positions that it was presented with that didn't really suit its style, or even objectively these positions weren't very good. But the losses that I'd like to examine now are in a very different category. They're from the main match that it played against Stockfish. So 1,000 games played, 155 wins for AlphaZero, and it lost 6 games. And they were simply from the normal chess starting position. I think these losses just tell us so much about AlphaZero's style. I find them fascinating, but also baffling at the same time. I'm going to show you 3 games, extracts from 3 games. They are all over 100 moves, so we're not going to look at all the moves, but just relevant positions. So this first one started out life as a Berlin, a Spanish opening, and the Berlin variation, which AlphaZero likes very much. Why does it like the Berlin endgame? I think it has a lot to do with the bishops, which we've seen that AlphaZero values greatly, and a solid pawn structure actually, and there are dynamic chances in the Berlin. It's not to everyone's taste, but there is no doubting that very often black reaches very complex positions, or both players reach very complex positions, and this is a typical Berlin. 2 bishops for black, reasonable pawn structure. Stockfish with white has managed to establish its knights on very nice central positions, and you can see this familiar pawn on e5 giving white space, but actually it's very difficult for white to make further progress here because black is so solid and has a nice structure. Stockfish played king g4. I should say this is move 47, so already a very long game. AlphaZero checked, the king has to go back, and they're repeating the position. And another check again, and now if knight f5, it's a draw by repetition. But here AlphaZero decided to play on. Clearly it thought it still had sufficient chances that it could play for a win, and it played rook e6, which is not a bad move at all. So it's gambling. In human terms, it's gambling. Now, over the next few moves, in fact, there were several opportunities for AlphaZero with black to force a draw, but it didn't. On each occasion, it's repeated a couple of times and then deviated. So it's really playing for a win. Now, 50 moves later, 50 moves, we reach move 100. Still a very complex position, actually. But Stockfish has started to gain control. It's a pawn up in this endgame. You can still see that pawn on e5. An endgame with bishops of opposite colour, and that means it's more complex. But here I can imagine many human players thinking, okay, I'm a pawn down with black, it's time to steer the game towards a draw. And here black can do that with a very simple force and continuation. Pawn to c5. Forces bishop takes pawn, of course, and bishop e6. Now if that rook were to come over here, for example, then black wins a piece with a check, and rook takes bishop. So rook c3 is a forced move, and then black can make a draw by repeating the position like this. Of course, the rook is protected by the bishop, and so on. Draw by repetition. King a3, rook a2 check. But no, AlphaZero wants to play on. It sees that it perhaps has some winning chances, and clearly doesn't think that the losing chances are so great. Well, let's see what happens. Now, again, it's a very long game. I'm going to leap forward to this position, and clearly AlphaZero with black has made little progress. And in fact, it's Stockfish that manages to make some progress. by giving up this pawn and then playing the bishop back here to take that pawn on h4, which doesn't seem like such a big deal, but actually in a moment we're going to see that the h-pawn for white has a very significant role to play in this game. So let's just go on a few moves. Now, I can imagine that AlphaZero probably thought, well, I still have chances here because of the c-pawn, which is going to roll down the board at any moment. Now, it's very, very difficult for white to make progress here. And I'm sure that objectively, somehow, black should draw this game. But these kind of endgames are still very, very complex. So the c-pawn looks dangerous. Now, if black were to trade here, this would be fatal because the h-pawn can advance. So AlphaZero avoids that and wants to push its c-pawn. But in fact, the c-pawn isn't so dangerous because the bishop and rook cover the queening square, but this pawn is. And the rook has to go all the way back to stop the h-pawn advancing. And now it's a case of bringing the king across to try to round up that pawn. And in fact, Stockfish manages to do that with some deft play. And gets to this position and takes it. So clearly this is a winning position now. It just needs for white to bring the bishop round to attack the rook, possibly from g7 as well. So let's just go through the last moves of the game. He gets there in the end on move 149. And here the game was terminated. That bishop will be able to come around here. And that's the end of the game. So, very curious somehow, but very interesting to see that AlphaZero is desperate to try to play for a win and is prepared to take great risks. But it's, I'm afraid it failed there. Now we have another endgame with bishops of opposite colour. And this also arose from a Berlin. Different variation, but Berlin nevertheless. And here, so AlphaZero again with black. It seems as though if anyone is better here, it must be black. You can see that that bishop protects this nice pawn on f3. The rook is very, very active on the second rank. And there's a passed pawn here, which the bishop has to take care of. And this pawn on d3 is clearly going nowhere. So I think it's understandable that AlphaZero wanted to play this one for a win. But in fact, it's impossible to make progress. Well, let me just show you the next few moves. With the active rook, keeping tabs on that bishop, it's actually impossible for black to make progress here. Well, basically the position didn't change much for about 50 moves. Seriously. 50 moves later, that's the position on the board, and very little has changed. The only thing that's changed is that this pawn has advanced one square, and the bishop has somehow found its way around here instead of on c6. But because Stockfish has kept the pawn on d3, it's impossible for black's bishop to check on this diagonal to force the king away, which would of course be winning. So this is still a completely drawn position. But what's bizarre is that now AlphaZero, instead of just, well, basically doing nothing and a draw will be agreed, wants to give away a pawn. It could just sit there. It could just play king d7 and there's nothing going on. But it wants to play h4 and give away a pawn. And this is really bizarre. So let's just go through the next few moves. It makes no real difference to the position. And in fact here, AlphaZero gives up its pride and joy, the f-pawn, in order to take the h-pawn here. But it's obvious that white is better. Pawn up for white. The h-pawn, there's a second h-pawn waiting in the wings. And it starts to advance. So somehow an absolutely crazy decision to play for a win. Now, maybe it just didn't realise that there would be so much danger here, clearly. But really, there's only one player that can win from this position. And that pawn is advancing. And one thing I would say is that endgames with bishops of opposite colour are notoriously difficult to assess for humans, and, well, in my experience, looking at some computer games, very difficult for computers to assess them as well. And I think one of the problems is that you can calculate very deeply, but somehow, for example, blockades are very difficult to appreciate for a machine, or lack of blockades, but also the sometimes the attacking chances as well. So here, well, let's just look at another option. Rook d5 check, checking the king back. In fact, this seems to be losing. So, for example, if rook takes pawn, we give a check. And h7, and this is a huge problem. Let's move the rook away, and then the bishop will be able to come here and force the h-pawn through. There are other variations, but you get the drift. King a6 looks like a weird move, and now there's a threat to, well, basically crawl into the position. If rook d5 here, king takes, then h7, and the pawn is going to roll through because there's going to be a check here, and h8. Rook d1 played. Let's just see how the game concluded. Bishop d8. And the king wanders across. So that bishop comes here to prevent the b-pawn from advancing. And the king comes in, bishop f8. So the rook can't move this way, because the rook will just come here and the pawn will go through. So that allows the white king to cross the 6th rank, and now it's just a case of, well, there's a threat to check and move the rook out of the way, and h8. So that avoids that one. Now the bishop comes here because it wants to come to g5 to shield the king when it comes to g7. b4 played, that's just hopeless, and that was taken. So basically the bishop can come back, come here, the king will come in, there are no checks, so the king will protect the h-pawn, and the rook moves away, and we get a queen on the next go. So yes, absolutely baffling. Coming back to this position, there was really no need to play h4. You have to remember that, well, for example, king d7, just passing, is just a draw, because white cannot take this pawn, because in that case, bishop takes pawn, check, wins the rook. And that's basically the case if white ever takes or wants to take any of these pawns. So after king d7, the game would just be a draw. So this is quite remarkable that somehow AlphaZero judged that it still had some kind of winning chances after this move. But it's pretty baffling, I have to say. Let's look at one more loss, or at least an extract from it. AlphaZero with white. They've been going back and forth in this position for a long time, actually. And you can see that the pawn structures are locked. There are no pawn breaks. So it's just a question of whether one of the kings can break through. Now, the black king cannot cross this line here. So if white wants to draw, then you can just shuffle with the king. But AlphaZero decides that he wants to somehow maneuver here. So it's possible to prevent the king coming in just with king c3, and again, it's just a stone cold draw. But AlphaZero wants to play on. Now it's possible just to play here, and this is also a dead draw because the bishop dominates the knight. So after this is a complete draw. And king d5 and so on. But let's go back. Stockfish has clearly appreciated here, with its depth of calculation, that actually king c4 gives it winning chances. Pawn is threatened. King a3. Bishop f1. So black's king just wants to wander into the position and grab pawns. But AlphaZero has probably seen so far that it can get its a-pawn through. However, Stockfish, with its brute force calculation, must have been able to see further, because when we get to this position, although AlphaZero queens first, in fact it's not possible to prevent the pawn from queening, and then black's king is close enough to these pawns and black stands better here. So there's a couple of checks, and the king hides on g3, and after queen e8 to prevent the pawn rolling forward. Then after king f2 there are no more checks, so the pawn is just going to roll through. So we've got queen and bishop against queen and knight, with a passed b pawn here, but in fact black's king is in the perfect position to scoop up these pawns, and that bishop does a very good job of potentially just controlling that b pawn. And here, objectively, black is just winning. So that must have been calculated by Stockfish, because it could have had a draw with bishop c4 earlier. And let's just see how the game concluded. The b pawn rolling, but not fast enough. And there are 3 pawns on the other side of the board. These kind of positions, of course, where just depth of calculation is crucial. Of course, Stockfish is going to be very, very strong at such positions. And here, the game was terminated. Let's see, king a6. I guess there's going to be a check here, and after the king moves, then the pawn will roll on again. And I mean, this is very difficult, still very difficult to force a win, but I'm guessing that's the way to do it anyway. So there we go. 3 losses, but extraordinary losses. In all cases, AlphaZero had an absolutely acceptable position, could have made a draw very easily, but just pushed it too hard, and suddenly found itself in a losing position. But I think, as far as I can see, the positions that were reached suited Stockfish well, because it was able to calculate to an enormous depth and realise that these positions were winning, whereas AlphaZero was still using its judgment. So there we go. AlphaZero, it seems, is not infallible.